Risk, that situation where the likelihood of getting to your Northern Star, achieving your end goals and objectives is derailed by some unforeseen brackets activity or event that actually makes you not get to where you want to get to. In last week's episode, check the show notes later on. I'll put a comment in there for the previous episode. We talked about the idea of risk, how we go about identifying it, looking in particular sectors, lots of things, having conversations with staff teams, senior management, and all the rest of it. And what we're going to focus on this week is doing something called a risk register. And this is nothing to do with school, by the way, folks. And registering it and actually doing something with that knowledge. The action points here. You're also going to see a very practical overview here. I'm going to show you a sheet that I've constructed, which you're more than welcome to have, but more of that after we have a little intermission and a little introduction, folks. So let's get some music. Let's get that blood circulation pumping, ready for the next few minutes. And as the saying goes, I'm back in the room. Hi folks, my name is Mahmood. By profession, trade, experience and skills, I'm an accountant, an educator, a mentor, author of a book, I Hate Numbers, by the way, the book that will change your life for the better, and also a financial storyteller. Now, in this week's episode on I Hate Numbers, I'm going to be talking to you about the practical stuff of actually putting together a risk register. And again, the risk register, you might be thinking, well, I don't need all that formality. But if you rely on probably the worst office in the world, i.e. what goes on between your ears, and you don't document, you don't get things out, and you don't put them on paper, virtual or otherwise, it becomes very difficult to make yourself accountable. It becomes very difficult to take action, and it makes it very difficult to share that with members of your team. So we're looking at a risk register, how we compile one. We're also going to be looking about action. The actions that we take or the inactions as they may be. Benefits of that is going to prevent that overwhelm, getting a bit of focus and clarity, and what is that if not to be commended. And we're also going to be talking about something called a CBA. Now, that's not an official legal document that's mentioned. That's a cost benefit analysis. So I think without further ado, let's just crack on with the show. Now, I think probably what I'm going to do here, I'm going to tuck myself in the little corner here, and I'm actually going to show you, as the Blue Peter badge would say, something I prepared earlier. Now, this is for a fictional situation, a fictional company. So I Hate Numbers have put together a risk register. Obviously, adapt for your own situation. If you feel, by the way, that you think this is such a fantastic template overview there, Mahmood, you presented to us, we'd love a copy. If you just leave a comment in the comments box, surprisingly enough, something like I Hate Numbers risk, then I will supply that to you. You can even go crazy and just put hashtag IHN risk. I'll see that and I'll make a link available, and you have it with my compliments and courtesy. So let us see where we are. Now I'm just going to play around with that. Yeah, that looks a bit rubbish, doesn't it, folks? So let's go here. So we've got a situation here. We've gone through and we've looked at all the risks that we have in our business. And remember, we're doing the exercise for ourselves. We're not doing the exercise for somebody else's business. So in our business here, we've got effectively 4 key types of risks that we're going to be looking at. The strategic, the big picture stuff. And if you look at the composition of the table in front of you, there are certain things that we've got to take into account. Now, the first thing we have to consider is what's the likelihood of that event actually occurring. Now, in other risk registers that I've come across, some people like to use narrative descriptions, which is perfectly fine. They might go low, they might go medium, and they might go high. That's very original. If you prefer the narrative, if you prefer the descriptive side of things, that's great. From a personal point of view, I like things registered and recorded as numbers where we can, because they're easy to monitor and it's easy to get some idea of scaling, some idea of focus itself. But likelihood for you could be literally insignificant, going to minor, going to catastrophic. Now, the impact is if that thing occurs, if we don't arrest it, if we don't stop it, what's the impact going to be to our organisation? Again, you can do it in that same sort of narrative style, going from minor, inconsequential, up to catastrophic. Put these things into context. If you imagine a meteorite coming from outer space, where else would it come from? Well, if it actually impacted and hit on the Earth, according to the dinosaurs that were extinct, that impact would be quite catastrophic. You'd have a great big ash cloud in the sky. It would block out the sunlight. Obviously, lots of things would die, including ourselves. So the impact on that would be very catastrophic. So therefore, the impact on our business and the rest of humanity is likely to be gravitating towards a 9 or possibly a 10, I would suggest. Now, the next thing to consider, though, is what is the likelihood of that actually event occurring? Now, for any sort of astronomers out there, any people who sort of follow these things here, meteorites, by the way, do land on Earth. We're talking about a certain size here. I don't think it has to be that big, by the way. The likelihood of something of significance impacting on the Earth is going to be quite small for a number of reasons. Most of them tend to burn out before they reach the Earth. Most of them tend to get sort of bumped off and sort of go off into the ether. So the likelihood, I would suggest, is likely to be gravitating towards the 1. So if we look at it, we know that the consequence of a meteorite impact on the Earth of a certain size is going to be pretty much shaky bum time, pretty much the end of things as we know it. But the likelihood of that occurring is going to be quite notional. It's going to be 1. So overall, that would have a risk score of, say, 10. I don't think you can actually go 0 to say it's never going to happen. Never is quite an absolute term, and we're going to be very careful of that being put down as a score. And what that would mean is we're conscious of it, we're aware it's out there, but we're not really going to divert a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of thinking time to worrying and getting over anxious about the meteorite hitting the Earth and destroying our business. Before we actually dive into these particular examples I've got, let me have a look at the composition of the table. So our first column is we've identified the risks in our organisation and our business. We've grouped them ideally under strategic, the big picture stuff, the financial, the impact on things like cash flows and profitability. We talk about the operational, the day-to-day running of the organisation. And the one that you can't clearly see here, and I'm just going to move the screen down a fraction, is the compliance. And that's obeying rules and regulations, either from local or central or international authorities, or it could be from your own professional body. So in my profession, certainly one of them, in the world of accounting, I'm regulated and governed by my own professional body. So there are certain things I can and cannot do, and if I were to do them, I would lose my license to practice. I'd get probably a fine, get mentioned in all the professional sort of journals as such, and that would be quite a walk of shame, as well as a loss of livelihood. Unregulated accountants, by the way, just as a footnote, aren't necessarily regulated by anybody. So again, a complete digression here. Just be very careful of those you deal with. So you're going to have, all professions will have a regulatory body that governs what they do. So then compliance will cover that act as well. Let's come back up. So we talk about likelihood. What's the likelihood of that situation occurring? We talk about the impact, and we're talking about the impact on our business. Given that, we cross multiply, a very nice term there, to give us what's called the risk score. Maximum is 100, and that's, I think, quite catastrophic. And 0 is, we can relax, we can, grab another martini, a gin and tonic, and we can actually go through our business life not having to worry about that particular thing. Now, the action, which I'm going to overlay in a few moments, is what do we do in light of what that risk score is? Now, there's a number of action options open to us, and in most things in life and in business, there are always things within your control. There are always things that you can do to modify and mollify the impact of something that's going to be quite negative. So that's the action point. The last column I left deliberately blank, by the way. You may decide to adapt that and have something like a comment, who are you going to allocate that responsibility to? So if you're a reasonably sized organisation, you may have somebody who's the overall sort of risk czar. That seems to be a very common term, doesn't it? The risk czar, the risk officer. And then you may allocate responsibilities for each of these individual things to somebody else. Obviously, you need somebody who's going to be the focal point. Comment by the way, could also mean things that you've got to develop, things you've got to get to. I'm not assuming, by the way, a perfect scenario for a business here. All businesses, whatever shape and size, will have a risk register, or should have a risk register, and will always have risks that go on. And they change. They're a moving feast, so they're not going to be static year on year. In organisations that I've helped and worked with and worked for over the last sort of 40 plus years, risk is something that's reviewed on a sort of reasonably regular basis. You may review your risk register once a year, but if you're operating in a very sort of volatile environment, you may decide to review it on a more frequent basis than that. So what I've done here, I've taken the 4 quadrants and I've just put in a couple of examples to talk us through how this would work. So we have a situation. Now, in order for us to score this, by the way, we need critically information. In my experience, many organisations, there's a lot that can be done to beef up, to improve their information systems. But if you don't have the information to help guide your decision making, to help guide what you think, then all you're doing is resting on instinct, which has its merits. You're relying on gut feel, which again has its merits, but it's a rubbish way to run your business. Information is there to either be ignored, to take on board, but you need a good, what I call, management information system. And when you talk about management information system, it's a term that's often ascribed to quite large organisations, and that's complete balderdash. All businesses, certainly with the advent of technology, with the advent of digitisation, going from humble things like digital accounting platforms, can plug in to all the different information sources you have around you. So if we imagine from your website, if you imagine from your internal compliance manuals, if you imagine from any social media things that you've got, if you've got a CRM system, which is called a customer relationship system, you've got your own accounting platform, all that data flows around. And what we need to do is to try and make it plug together, plug in, so we've got a nice cohesive unit. But ultimately, you need to understand, you need to have access to information to guide your decision making and what you include, particularly in this table. So we've got a situation here that we have a product or service, all of them, some of them, or none of them is actually not selling. So we're not getting the traction. This could be a brand new product that we've launched. It's good feedback, people like it, but actually we're not shifting. It's not shifting, it's not selling. We could have an existing product line that's probably in a state of decline, question mark, and we're not getting the sales, we're not getting that profitability. Now, how do we know? Well, we've got stats, we've got information. So we should be monitoring what we're selling. We should be monitoring what we're selling by the groups of products and services that we do, and we can track those sales volumes. We can track what's going on. We can track, or we should be able to track, which customers are engaging, so you can see if it's not selling. Now the impact, obviously the impact will be if that decline, if it is a decline, is continuing. Well, it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure out that if your sales are going that way, effectively that's generating less revenue, generating less profitability, generating less cash flow, and what that's going to mean is you're going to hit the skids at some point, or certainly have a very challenging time. So what are the actions that we can do? Well, there are quite a lot that we can actually do. So first of all, we need to understand why it's not selling. Is there something about the pricing? Is there something about the description of the product, the advertising, the marketing that's going behind that? Are there some issues in terms of quality? Are there issues in terms of how we're dealing with that and engaging that? Is it something that we've not renewed and refreshed our product and service line? Is it something that we could look at to diversify into different markets? Can we actually sell what we're selling to more people, a different demographic, a different product group? So there's lots of things that we can do, but once we understand what's going on, then we can actually formulate the action accordingly. I'll put another strategic risk, which is quite unfortunately endemic in quite a number of organisations that are successful financially, could still have very poor planning. Now, obviously, because it's a family show at this time of day, we're talking about very poor planning, and a lot of organisations have areas of their planning that can certainly be improved, certainly can be beefed up. And poor planning, by the way, is given as a key reason for those companies that don't actually succeed and financially suffer and actually eventually unfortunately go into liquidation. Now, what's the likelihood? If you've got no formal systems, if you've got no strategic plan, if you've got no something that's formulated that says, here is my Northern Star, here's my end objective, this is my route map. If you don't have that and you're not looking ahead at least 12 months, to me, that's poor planning. If you don't have that structure, if you're not reviewing your plan, if you're not monitoring, if you don't have your own financial story, and you know that's not going on at the moment for whatever the reason is, then obviously that's a 9 that's going to be scored. The impact of poor planning, well, I've been very generous and put it as a 9. I would probably say, I'd probably put that closer to 9, maybe 10. And the impact, the risk of that is quite high. Well, what's the action point? The action point is to move towards a culture of planning and looking into the future. Don't look at your rear view mirror, look in front of you, look through the windscreen as such. Now, in all these action points that we take, by the way, if you have a base position of quite minimal, you're not really doing these things, and there's a lot to be done, behavior takes time to change. So you're looking for a small incremental change that moves the dial, a very American sort of Dragon's Den type phrase there, that moves you one step closer to where you want to. So if you have no plans in place, then I would start by articulating and thinking about what your end point looks like. So if me and you had a chat in 12 months' time and we were discussing where your business is that what it looks like to you? Is that where you want to take it? And if you can start with that and then figuring out what you need to do to get there, that's a fantastic start. Do you have cash flows in place? Do you have an idea of what that business activity translates to in terms of cash activity? Now let's drill down. Let's go down a bit further. So we're talking about the financials now, and we may have an issue in terms of not getting paid. Now, I've given it a low score in this theoretical assumption. I've assumed that we've got good credit control procedures. We check the creditworthiness of our clients and customers that we take on. We monitor very strictly our credit terms. We've looked at things like our reports. And if you're sitting at home thinking, what on earth is he talking about? As a bare minimum, if you're offering credit facilities, you're offering credit to somebody, the risk lies with you. You need to make sure you've got something in-house, in place, whether it's your digital accounting system that actually knows when you send the invoice out, you've aged it, you can monitor it, you review the reports, and it says, but actually, pretty much all customers pay on time. It could be that you pretty much take deposits off people, but whatever it is, we've given it a low score because history dictates that we're doing pretty good on that. What's the impact of not getting paid? Well, I've given it a 9. Obviously it would probably be a 10 if you're not getting paid, then eventually bye-bye business. So overall in this scenario, it's given a very low score of 36. Let's assume what would happen. You decide to, you know you've got cash flow problems, you drill down a bit deeper and you look at the fact that actually customers aren't paying you on time. The number of days you're waiting to get paid is increasing and increasing. That cash flow, according to your bank statement, looks very depressing. So you might decide, actually, not getting paid, we might allocate that to an 8. Overall, the score moves up much higher. Well, the action points are things like credit control, how you communicate with clients at the beginning when you onboard them, terms and conditions, the terms of credit that you're giving, assessing how risky somebody is before you take them on. Are you setting credit limits? If they breach those credit limits in terms of time or going over, what do you actually do? If you just purely generate reports and send emails and do nothing else, you've got a very weak control system there. You need to up your game and you need to take action accordingly. So can you change the mix? Have you got a few bad payers in there that's dragging everything else down? And you may decide to have that conversation where you and the client and the customers part company. Ultimately, there's always legal action against that, but we want to try and stop that. So therefore, there's a lot we can do to improve that flow of cash going through the business. Now, again, product profitability decline. Well, how do we know? We should have systems telling us. And in terms of something like a digital system, so for lots of clients that I look after, where they've got more than one product or service, where they've got different price points for those products and services, you can track those on a system like Xero, for example, and you can actually look at the profitability by those groups. So if they're going down in place, if they're going down, the likelihood of that is it's a continual trend. You've not done anything to refresh what you're offering to clients. You've not changed it as such. Again, it doesn't always mean you have to change it, but if you're seeing a decline with nothing to replace that, well, that likelihood is 8. The impact, again, I've given it a 9 because I'm feeling quite comfortable and generous at this point today. But again, it's a high risk score. What can you do? Well, innovation. Are there ways to introduce new services and products? Can you tinker? Can you modify? Can you bring up to date what you're offering at the moment? So in terms of the services and products that you offer at the moment, are there improvements? Are there things that you can diversify into? Are there replacements? All things have a natural product life cycle. They could be several weeks or several years. Most products and services will get to a point, like a bit of a bell. You can see my finger, I'm not being rude. They will get to a maturity point and then eventually they will all decline. So you need to have something coming up to replace that. Let's move up, folks. Now again, if you're just hopping on and you're thinking, what's this wonderful piece of knowledge that we're looking at here? Just an introduction, my name is Mahmood, accountant, mentor, educator and book writer. And it's called, surprisingly enough, I Hate Numbers here. If you've got comments, throw them into the comments box, hashtag replay. If you have got other risks that we've not mentioned that you think are significant, other action points you want to share with the audience, by all means, share them away. So let's have a look at the operational side of things. So again, depending on what your business is, there may be a risk that you've identified in getting supplies delivered to you. You may be a retailer or a manufacturer. You may have those products being shipped overseas from China. China is going through a bit of a battle at the moment in terms of logistics, in terms of getting those products out of the door. There's shipping problems caused not just by COVID of recent times, but other issues here. And, you know, it may be that you've got to increase the amount you order in advance. You've got to wait much longer. There may be supplies coming internally from the where you are operating from, but are there supply chain challenges? Now you've got a likelihood is 7. The impact on that is 9. Again, if you've got no supplies, ultimately, if you don't get supplied of the key ingredients, the key commodities that you've got, then that is going to have a massive impact on your ability to continue. What's the actions that you can do? Well, you can look at alternative supply chains. You look at alternative supplies. You can look to source more locally. You could actually look at alternative replacement items. Are there things that you can do to your product and service? Have you overhauled the product and service and eliminated anything that's not adding value to it, to the customer experience or yourself? So those are things that one can do. Now, these are only samples, folks, a mere flavour of the different risks, and it's the thought process that we're going through that's more important. Now, staff recruitment. If you've got battles, challenges, as lots of people will have in different industries, are recruiting good caliber, competent staff, the likelihood of that may be, based on what's going on, an 8 out of 10. And the impact on that, certainly if it's key staff, you may consider the risk in that situation to be an 8. So that's going to give you a relatively high score. Now, what can you do? Well, lots of options to explore. And let's say we generalize, you can do things from outsourcing perhaps, look at different ways to automate perhaps. And automation, by the way, has that effect of relying less on the human individual. There may be tasks and routines and operations that are carried out that automation can step into. Are there ways to actually improve the flow through of the work that's being done? So process improvements. What that means is there's less pressure on your existing staffing infrastructure, and therefore you've got better ways of doing these things. And the end of this, by the way, when I finish with compliance, I'm going to talk to you about what's called CBA. So it's not saying go off and do the action. There's what's called a cost benefit analysis that you've got to do for all the action points. You've got to do a CBA, and I'll explain more of that in a few minutes. Now, compliance is the last thing, and that's basically not following the rules, the regulations. And if we look at things like accounts and tax forms, we've got to get that in there. It may be your track record is pretty good. You get things on time. You don't miss deadlines. Therefore, you give it a low score, a 3. The impact, if you don't file on time, can be quite high. It can affect things from fines and penalties that you may get. It also has a reputational risk, depending on what those forms actually are. And by the way, folks, not filing accounts on time, or certainly very close to the wire, also affects your credit score as well. So again, one has to be very careful when it comes to filing. It sometimes may be given a secondary consideration, but these things getting on time, can have a big detrimental effect. What's the actions? If it's a low score, you decide that is a significant risk. Again, make sure you've understood you've got a timetable. Make sure that you liaise with whatever advisors you're dealing with externally to get those things on time. Make sure there's a good understanding, records kept up to date, all that sort of stuff. Now, copyright infringement or theft. Now, it may be you inadvertently, when you're doing some marketing promotion, you're using images that you haven't sought to get the copyright for, ones that haven't got that common use license, and then you run the risk of being sued. You run the risk of somebody pursuing you. It's the intellectual property you're stealing. It could be your copyright. It could be your intellectual property you're creating, whether it's a work of art, whether it's something you're writing. Now, the impact could be quite low because you don't actually publish a lot, you don't actually use a lot of imaging, you don't use other people's work, etc. But the impact, if it is either from you to them or them taking yours, could be quite high. What you're going to do, you're going to divert the competition. You're actually going to have a detrimental impact if you're caught. There could be fines, and there's obviously the impact on you of having all that sweat and equity disappearing out the front door. What can you do though? Well, obviously where you can, assert your copyright. Make sure you've got that little C symbol on things that you write. Make sure where it's appropriate that you register trademarks. They aren't that expensive these days, by the way. So for example, I Hate Numbers is a registered trademark, as is an event that I do once a year called Love My Accountant Day. Those are registered trademarks. Now, it doesn't mean somebody won't infringe that, but it just gives you something in the armory if you need to give you some level of protection. So I'm not necessarily of the school of thought that says there's nothing you can do. Obviously, you've got to put these things into context, but at least do a minimal amount of protection. If you're using somebody else's work, by the way, it's not only bad form not to accredit that source. Make sure you quote the source. If appropriate, check the T's and C's and make sure you seek permission. Some people might say, who cares? Let's just do it. If we get caught, we get caught. Again, we all conduct businesses in different ways. And my viewpoint would be, if you're going to quote somebody else's work, it's a bit dickish not to at least quote who they are. It's also plagiarism, and it's also stealing and being a bit naughty. And that's not a very good thing to do in business. Let's resolve this now by talking about CBA, cost benefit analysis. Every single action that you do, you must adopt what I call a seesaw approach. So if you imagine a seesaw balanced very well at the equilibrium, the fulcrum point is what's the cost in terms of resources, in terms of money, in terms of skills to actually take that action, and what's the benefits you're going to get. So some insurance companies will take that view. In fact, not insurance companies, let's talk about public buildings. There are a lot of government-owned buildings that aren't actually insured, believe it or not. The reason behind that, apart from its very expensive premium, is they will take that risk that if it all does blow up, if something does happen, it's cheaper to put it right than it is to actually take out the insurance premium. So every action that you're considering, you need to think about, okay, where's the benefit coming to me? Is it a reputational benefit? Is it a financial benefit? Is it going to be my business could go under benefit? And what's the resources and the cost of me implementing that? And also what's the cost of not doing that? Okay, folks, let's drop the sheet. Let's come out there. Let's come back into the room. So we've gone through here. We've gone through like a risk register, a matrix. Sounds very Keanu Reeves here. We put something together there. The document itself, if you're interested, put that comment into the comments box on #replay, and I'll gladly share a copy of this with you. So think about the nature of the risk, the likelihood of it occurring, the impact it will have, and what's the action you're going to take to actually put it right, to rectify that, to minimize that impact. Also, remember, you need information to flow to help you understand what's going on in your business. So I hope you've got some benefit from this, folks. Obviously, I appreciate any comments and feedback that you've got. And until next week, obviously, as Nick Ross would say, don't have nightmares.